All right, so with that, we'll move on to our next presentation. And this presentation is the Oregon Collaborative Programmatic CCAA for Sage-grouse. And Angela, is it Sitz or Sitz?
It's Sitz, thank you.
Sitz, okay. Well, you know, I had a 50-50 on that. So, so I will turn it over to you, and just so that you know, and then for the folks that are listening in and watching this, the video that you have a few slides down, we are prepared to present that. Everybody will need to control their own volume. It may come a little bit loud from us. So we noticed that it's a little louder than other sounds you might be getting from your computer. So if there are any issues with that, folks, just be ready when we get to that point and dial your volume. So with that, Angela, please.
Okay, good afternoon, and thanks, Susan. I'm a little nervous because that first slide does not look like the slide I sent in. So I'm like, oh no, what's going on with my presentation? Hopefully everything else is still there.
I'm gonna hope that too.
What?
I said, I'm gonna hope that too. I believe that was what we had, but yeah.
I know, it's just the background image is different. It's the default image. It's not a big deal. It just, you know, when it pops up and it's different, you think, oh no, what am I getting into?
Yes.
It's fine though. I'll wing it one way or another. So as Susan said, I'm Angela Sitz, and I'm a wildlife biologist with the Fish and Wildlife Service. I've been working for the service for over 18 years and have spent the last nearly 10 years working on sage-grouse conservation in southeastern Oregon. Much of the area that Brenda and Ben were talking about in that last presentation is the area that I've been working on. Okay, next slide. Okay. Oops, back one. You went to. Okay. All right. So some brief background on the agreement that I'm going to talk about today. It was a grassroots effort that began back in 2011. It began during a livestock producer educational event hosted by the Oregon State University Extension, when producers were fearful of a potential sage-grouse listing and began asking questions about CCAAs, which are candidate conservation agreements with assurances. The service was not involved in these initial discussions, but was asked to participate after the group had met a few more times to discuss the pros and cons of engaging in such an agreement. I have been representing the service since these initial discussions back in 2011. There was a diverse group of stakeholders engaged at monthly and sometimes bi-monthly meetings held in the basement of the Harney County Courthouse. The process was not formally facilitated, and the agreement took about 3.5 years to be developed and signed. Now I'm going to hopefully show you a brief video that was produced by the service back in 2015 to talk about the CCAAs. So we'll see if the next video works. Dozens of ranchers approached the Fish and Wildlife Service about putting together a candidate conservation agreement with assurances for sage-grouse in Harney County. Besides those ranchers, there was a diverse group of partners. The Soil and Water Conservation District was a key partner. They're actually the permit holder for the agreement. The federal partners were the Bureau of Land Management, Ag Research Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Natural Resource Conservation Service. The state partners included Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, Oregon Department of State Lands, Oregon State University Extension, along with the Nature Conservancy.
We have been active for the last 3.5 years in this county in developing candidate conservation agreements to protect our landowners in the event of a sage-grouse listing. The benefits of that program for me have been that I've received a lot of technical assistance from agencies to assist me in determining what types of on-the-ground projects could be developed to improve the habitat areas for both the sage-grouse as well as for my own livestock. Here in Harney County, we developed the term good for the bird, good for the herd. Some of those programs have involved juniper thinning, some have involved putting up fencing to protect riparian areas, the wet areas where the sage-grouse depends upon. Some of those projects have involved putting some reflective markers upon the new fencing that has gone up to avoid bird strikes. So we're at the beginning of it, but well on our way.
All of the ecological issues we are dealing with are going to provide a dual benefit. They're going to provide a benefit to the wildlife, and they're going to provide a benefit to the rancher. The major issues out here are, wildfire, invasive species, and juniper encroachment. And if we can reduce and remove those threats on their lands, it's going to improve their operation, and it's going to improve it for, all the species that depend upon it.
We have elk, deer, and antelope, and sage-grouse, among other things, wildlife, and our livestock to take care of on that land. We have good local people who understand the business and understand the environment, the country, and the landscape, vegetation. We're trying to suppress the annual grasses and replace it with perennial grass. We're working hard on the Medusa head problem and the cheatgrass problem because that's our main problem on our private land. It's an ongoing battle.
Involving the new science in how we manage our lands, we're able to utilize the efforts of our partners and the science, and with the rancher being the landowner, effectively get down on the ground, make these changes which become the conservation measures that improve the habitat. Making water improvements, removal of juniper, treating the annual invasive types of species that could come in, preparing and to mitigate the potential of wildfires that could come through and destroy an entire area. These are all important to cattlemen, but they're also important to the bird.
We saw the work with the Fish and Wildlife as a cooperative agreement of being able to sustain that business. I see us as being the original environmentalists because we have to protect the land to protect our way of life. When we show how many acres we have seeded or built bird ramps in our troughs and marked our fences, we've been doing it, but we need to show people that we're doing it. I see it as a way of preserving our way of life, really.
I think partnership with the ranchers is going to be key to making these efforts successful. We need to be able to keep them on the land and keep their operations viable to maintain this habitat into the future and to keep uses on the land that are compatible with sage-grouse. And CCAAs are just one piece of that puzzle.
Okay, next slide before it goes to some random video.
Trying. There we go. See if we can get that shut
Hey,
down.
it worked though, so that was good, and it didn't.
That was great.
Room, so that was good.
Yeah, okay, hang on here. Let me get you. There we go.
Okay, great. Okay, so what exactly is a CCAA? CCAAs cover candidate species. While sage-grouse are no longer candidates, the agreements are still valid. At the time the Oregon County CCAAs were written, the CCAA standard was as follows. When evaluating a potential CCAA, the Fish and Wildlife Service must determine that the benefits of the conservation measures to be implemented by a property owner under a CCAA, when combined with those benefits that would be achieved if the conservation measures were also to be implemented on other necessary properties, it would preclude or remove any need to list the covered species. The standard has changed slightly since these agreements were finalized, but these agreements fall under this standard. This agreement contains conservation measures to address threats to sage-grouse on enrolled lands. Some examples include cutting juniper, marking high-risk fences, changing grazing management. At a minimum, landowners must agree to Conservation Measure 1, which states that you must maintain contiguous habitat by avoiding further fragmentation. In other words, no further development except in the limited circumstances for ranch-related infrastructure. And you must have at least one conservation measure in place to address each identified threat. The agreements must contain monitoring provisions for both compliance and effectiveness. Enrollees can unenroll at any time with 30 days written notice. and only non-federal lands can be enrolled. Next slide, please. The Oregon agreements are with the local soil and water conservation districts. They hold the permit and are the agreement signers. The agreements are in place for 30 years. The SWCD also has privacy protections in place with landowners to ensure that their sensitive information is protected. These agreements also require baseline inventory of all lands to be enrolled, annual monitoring for compliance, and longer-term monitoring to determine effectiveness of conservation measures implemented, as well as updated baseline and trend monitoring. Next slide, please. Okay, so what's in it for the landowner? Interested landowners can contact their local SWCD, and the staff then work with the landowner to develop a site-specific plan, or SSP. The SWCD serves as the intermediary between the service and the landowner. Once the plan is approved by the service issues the district a certificate of inclusion that provides the landowner with the assurances in the form of incidental take coverage should sage-grouse be listed sometime in the future. This coverage assures the landowners of two things. Should the species become listed in the future, nothing further, so no further conservation actions, will be required of the enrollees. Should incidental take occur while conducting covered activities, enrollees will be covered for that incidental take. The term covered activities refers to those activities carried out by the enrolled landowner or their representative on enrolled lands that may result in authorized incidental take of the covered species. In this case, covered activities include ongoing and planned rangeland practices, implementation of the conservation measures, and ongoing inventory and monitoring activities. Next slide, please. So this map shows the area covered by each of the agreements. I realize it's probably a little hard for folks to read, but the yellow areas are the acres of private land eligible to enroll, and the pink acres are the Department of State land acres that are fully enrolled. Next slide. All right, so shared vision. So one of the reasons the agreement took so long to be developed is that in 2011, when we first began working together with all the stakeholders, we lacked a shared vision. We spent much of our time arguing about what to measure. The service wanted very detailed sage-grouse specific metrics measured, like grass height and forb density, which are extremely variable in both time and space and vary widely from year to year depending on precipitation. It took the group nearly a year to agree on the inventory and monitoring protocol that would be the foundation of the agreement. Key stakeholders from the Agricultural Research Service and Oregon State University Extension assisted in the development of a set of simple threat-based models to be used in baseline monitoring and subsequent trend monitoring. But they also served as an important communication tool. The graphic shown here depicts the annual grass threat model, which basically divides the ecosystem into 4 simple boxes. These are the states that Ben was referring to in the last presentation. State A is healthy sagebrush steppe with an intact functioning understory of perennial grasses and forbs. State B is the same as State A, except it lacks a sagebrush overstory. State B is basically what you would expect to see if State A were to burn. State C has a vigorous sagebrush overstory, but lacks desirable understory plants and is often dominated by annual grasses like cheatgrass and medusa head. State D is an annual grassland and is what we would expect to see when State C burns. The development of these simple models allowed us to communicate with one another about the threats that livestock producers and sage-grouse are both threatened by. Invasive annual grasses in the lower elevations, coupled with too much wildfire and conifer encroachment in the mid and upper elevations. There were originally 2 other models that look very similar to the one shown here. One was representing areas threatened by conifer encroachment, and the other, the dual threat model, where both threats are playing on the ecosystem. Next slide. So since the development of these early models, they have evolved significantly over time and have resulted in 2 peer-reviewed publications and 1 more currently under review. The one shown here is a glossy weatherproof field guide that outlines the process used to assess sagebrush steppe communities using this approach. Next slide. When folded out, the backside is a decision tree that guides managers in assessing rangelands based on the degree of threat from invasive annual grasses and conifer. Next slide. The second publication is a 33-page manager's guide that goes into more detail of how to use this assessment approach. These publications were produced in partnership with Oregon State University Extension, the Nature Conservancy, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, the Agricultural Research Service, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Next slide. Okay, so let's get back to those agreements and talk about the implementation progress. So since the signing of the agreements in 2014 and 2015, the districts have enrolled 45 landowners across 6 counties, enrolling nearly 530,000 acres of habitat within the covered area, which totals nearly 3.5 million acres, not including the Oregon Department of State lands acreages, which accounts for another nearly 600,000 acres of enrolled lands. Just under half of the district acres enrolled are in core habitat, which is the same as BLM's priority habitat management areas, or the services PACs. Essentially, it's the best of the best habitat. There are approximately 120 additional landowners awaiting enrollment, representing an additional 600,000 acres, which would bring the total enrollment to over 1.1 million acres within the covered area. Lack of funding and staffing is preventing the development of these additional plans. Next slide. So these graphics show the annual treatment acres for enrolled lands. So from 2015 to 2018, there was a total treatment of juniper of 48,605 acres, just over 40,600 acres of invasive annual grass treatment. Most of that's primarily Medusa head treatment, and over 48 miles of fence have been marked. Next slide. This is just one example showing a before on the left and an after on the right of a juniper treatment project on an enrolled property. And next slide. And this is just a couple photos showing fence marking. So this agreement has led to some unique collaborative opportunities. The local high school actually produces these fence markers. And then if landowners are interested, they can not only buy their fence markers from the local ag program, they can also have them install them. Next slide. All right, so ongoing challenges. The biggest challenges related to the implementation of the CCAAs has been sustainable funding and consistent staffing at the districts. To date, over $12 million has been spent on implementation, conducting baseline inventory and monitoring for all the SSPs, with the majority of these funds being spent on implementing conservation measures like juniper and annual grass control outlined in each plan. The primary sources of funding for these agreements has been NRCS's Sage-grouse initiative, and several of the districts received a RCPP, Regional Conservation Partnership Program grant, through NRCS as well. These funds, coupled with grant funding and a large focused investment partnership program grant from the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, which is funded by lottery dollars in Oregon. To compound this challenge, staffing at nearly all of the districts has been extremely challenging. Many of the staff end up leaving for more stable positions, usually at partner agencies, in particular BLM and NRCS. These two challenges together have a huge impact on the overall biggest contributor to the successful implementation of the CCAAs, relationships with producers. As most of you know, creating relationships and gaining trust of those in the livestock producer communities take time. With a lack of reliable funding for implementation and soft-funded positions, it is difficult for the districts to retain high-quality staff. Next slide. All right, so I realize there's a ton going on and I don't expect you to read this slide. I just wanted to share this one pager with you because, as previously stated, the biggest challenge with implementing an agreement of this size is funding. Last fall, for the annual meeting, we assisted the districts in developing this one pager to outline the inventory and long-term monitoring costs associated with each plan. For those of you that aren't familiar with SageCon, the SageCon partnership's overarching goal is to advance policies and actions that reduce threats to sage-grouse and Oregon's sagebrush ecosystem, as well as promote rural, community, and economic health. According to the goals, approaches, and strategies adopted in this 2015 State Action Plan. Brett's presentation, who is up next, will provide you with more details. This graphic was intended to help the districts leverage legislative funds through the state. This graphic can also be used to explain to funding partners the long-term costs associated with monitoring these agreements. Keep in mind, this graphic only outlines the long-term funding associated with baseline inventory and long-term monitoring. It does not touch on the costs associated with implementing conservation measures. However, funding conservation measures through NRCS and OWEB funding has proven to be a successful means of funding thus far. The service continues to work with the districts to streamline monitoring provisions, and we are currently working with the districts on the development of a database that will streamline inventory and long-term monitoring processes and reduce overall monitoring costs. Next slide. In summary, these are long-term plans with expensive commitments, and the bottom line is each mid-sized plan, which is about 5,000 to 15,000 acres, costs nearly $70,000 over the life of the plan for the baseline inventory and long-term monitoring. In my mind, if districts could at a minimum receive sustainable base funding to cover these costs, they could provide a reliable source of employment and decrease staff turnover. Staff could focus on funding conservation measures and not worry about the ongoing inventory and monitoring burden. Next slide. So overall, these agreements have been successful, but their continued success hinges on the long-term sustainable funding leveraged by strong working relationships between the SWCD staff, enrolled landowners, and the service. And that's all I have. So I can take some questions if I didn't ramble on too long.
You did not ramble on too long. That was great. We do have a hand raised. Holly Kennedy, I'm going to unmute you. So you are unmuted. No, almost unmuted. Give me just a second here, Holly. I might need to get some help from Liz, if Liz could.
It will usually pop something up that Holly probably needs to accept.
Okay, so Holly, if you could take a look and see if you got a message asking you to accept being unmuted, that would be great, and then we can get to your question. There you go. Okay, Holly, I think you're able to be heard now. I thought. Holly, can you, it looks like you had the ability to be unmuted, or that you did unmute. Liz, got any ideas? I lost Holly completely.
I no longer see her in the list, so she
Okay.
might have jumped off.
All right, could have just been a timing thing. Looking for other questions. If anyone has a question to submit or raise a hand for Angela, we'll give that just a pause here. Holly had raised her hand about midway through your presentation, Angela, so hopefully we didn't just wait too long. I just didn't want to interrupt your presentation. So I am not seeing any hands right now. So I think you are probably also off the hook for getting any questions. We certainly appreciate it very much. Thank you for that presentation. And as with the other speakers that we've had, really thought-provoking things to bring to the breakout groups next week. Looking forward to that. Okay, so one thing that I did not do is give folks just a brief couple of minutes to step away from their screens. We have one more presentation that I would like to give people that opportunity. So why don't we just pause for maybe 4 minutes or so and give people a chance to stand up and go get a drink of water or something. And then we'll get started back here in about 4 minutes. And I will be sure to let people know that we are about to reconvene. So let's go ahead and take a pause, and we'll be back in just a few minutes.